there is a possibility that you finding a way to achieve that position is going to put you in a similar position to you being able to squat, so that after doing that stretch, which is really what we're saying is just a way to change the shape of your skeleton versus gravity. Because again, that sort of position where I'm in quadruped or facing the ground, the gravity is going to allow me to get some expansion from front to back a little bit easier, so I don't get squeezed from front to back as much like I would when I was on if I was on my back. And then that can allow me to achieve a shape that can give me all the way into that deep hip and knee flexion. Right. So your squat might improve, but it isn't because I had you sit back in a child's pose with your knees out to stretch your groin muscles. It wasn't a groin stretching problem. It was literally a shape change that needed to happen in your pelvis and your rib cage to allow you to get to that depth.
Welcome to Reconsider. I'm Bill Hartman. This is the podcast to challenge you to ask better questions, to look beyond traditional models of thinking and arrive at better health and fitness solutions.
You could actually, if you get into some of the PNF stretching literature, I believe the shortest duration that I saw was a 6 second.
Okay.
Hold. Oh no. Okay. So it's been a long time since I've looked directly at the literature because it's boring. It's exceptionally boring and consistently shows the same outcome. But I think okay, so PNF things, they used to do really long holds and then said that was good. And then they said, well, wait a minute, if we hold it for 6 seconds or we hold it for 30 seconds, it's the same outcome. And I think Magnuson did a study in 96 where they did a 6-minute hold and compared it to a very brief hold that was just a matter of seconds, and there was no difference. And in fact, the apparent benefit was very
right. And what were the consistent findings in most of the studies?
Almost without fail, number one, there were small changes, so a matter of just a few degrees. So for the sake of argument, let's just say it was 10 degrees of change. All right, but this is 10 degrees of shape change. This is not joint movement. So this is one of those things that is the knife in my side, so to speak. That
right. Well, because the movement that they're measuring, what they're measuring is joint range of motion, correct?
Well, that's what they think they're measuring, but they're not.
Yeah. So they're typically in these studies, they're having someone hold a position, feeling some sort of tension in a muscle. And they're checking how far they can touch their toes, how far they can raise their leg up when they're laying on their back. Yeah. And that becomes the determining factor for what is good or bad.
Right.
Which is silly, because how could that, just looking at it without any sort of expertise in fitness or movement, just seeing someone trying to touch their toes and then they can touch their toes easier, or they have a few more inches of motion. Who determined and who decided that was good? It's a great question, right?
I don't know.
know. Which kind of leads us back to our questioning, having the podcast ask the questions and reconsider these things. It's well, who determined that this was good? Why is it good? And it's was stretching is helpful for back pain? It's okay, well, why?
Because someone did it, and it was helpful. But then the question mark is why? And this goes for anything, not just we can pick on stretching because it's easy, but why is anything perceived as being a solution?
Right, because it worked in some case,
right,
and then we try to extrapolate that to everyone else.
Right, and you can tell because the questions that I get clinically are I give people activities to do. They have an outcome that is favorable. They are aware that the outcome is favorable because they have a reduction in symptoms. They feel the differences in excursion of movement and et cetera. Then their next question is, are there any other stretches that I should do?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, because everybody equates stretching with something that's favorable in regards to an outcome.
Right.
So this is one of those things where, and it's rampant in our industries. And the same goes for any industry. They all have their own little things. But the low barrier to entry in as far as education is concerned, people don't question anything. And so then they just make an assumption that, okay, stretching is good, more stretching is better. This stretch has to be good because I feel it here. This is good for that. Like they just say that it is. And then somebody else that doesn't question it because they don't have the capacity to question it. They don't have a filtering system. They don't have a mental model. And they say, this is good. And then they tell the next guy, this is good. And then the next thing you know, you have this cancerous spread of bad information, misinformation, misunderstanding. And now everybody says that stretching is good. So now let's go back in time. So what's yoga, like 3,000 years old?
Yeah, it's like 3000 BCE or something like that.
Yeah. And
maybe
so,
even before then.
Probably, yeah.
I'm sure about Asian, Indian.
I'm sure that there was a caveman that threw his foot up on a rock and bent forward and got a little hammy stretch before he had to run from a saber-toothed tiger or something like that. But yeah, this has been a long time coming because people were always looking for solutions. Occasionally, they'll accidentally do something that is favorable. Because of the perception of where people feel things, they think that is an explanation of why they are successful. So case in point, you sit on the floor, you put your legs out in front of you, you bend forward and you feel like a tug on the back of your thigh or the back of your hip or wherever you might feel it. And so you have a limited scope of understanding of anatomy and you immediately go, that's my hamstring. I am stretching my hamstring. It's like, no, you feel a sensation that is emanating from those connective tissues in that area, but there's no guarantee that you're doing anything to the contractile element at all.
Because you're not.
Because you're not. Exactly. Because you're not. You're not. In fact, it may be actually trying to shorten against your wishes because it's really uncomfortable. And that doesn't mean that muscle is relaxing. It doesn't mean that anything's getting longer. In fact, muscles just don't do that. They really don't.
Right. So what we're going to do is, just because the people typically watching this, we're in the podcast, by the way, the people typically watching this within the first 5 to 8 minutes usually stop watching. So Bill and I are going to talk about what stretching is actually doing to the muscle tissues toward the end of the podcast. So you can either skip through the chapters and go to the end, or you can wait around and listen to all the
well, we don't want to ruin the ending.
Great information. Well, we're not going to ruin the ending. We're going to kind of skip past that. We will come back to what is actually happening when we stretch, but I think we should circle back to like the history of it a little bit.
Yeah, maybe a little.
Yeah, it's like the Greeks did some stretching. That was like, I guess there's some record of that, like they do that before battle. It sort of just makes sense, right? It's like the positions that you're gonna try to get into in order to like run or throw a javelin or whatever these other things are gonna do. You might want to try to like access that range of motion,
right. Even though you can't. Even though you can't.
So you try to just kind of hang into it or stretch into it or find whatever way that you can to get your arm overhead and feel a stretch or the tension.
Yes. And that is discomfort, by the way. Like it's uncomfortable. And so let's just put it into the category of we're actually producing a pain that we will perceive as good, which this is another thing that kind of bugs me about stuff. It's like people think that they need to feel bad to feel good.
Which we talked about in one of our previous podcasts, actually.
Yeah. But it's like it just goes into that territory. It really bugs the bejesus out of me. And so then that creates a false understanding that gets perpetuated. It's like, oh no, you need to pull on this harder. It's like, oh, discomfort is good. It's like, well, discomfort is associated with stretching. In fact, one of the reasons that you may be able to change the shape of your body to a greater degree is that over time, you actually create what is called stretch tolerance, which is actually an increase in your pain tolerance, right?
Sure.
So it does allow you to access a shape. So pulling on tissues is uncomfortable, and it will allow you to pull on them further up to a point. So there's a point where there is an elastic element to connective tissues, and then there's a point beyond that, which is called the plastic region, which is where if you go there, the original length is unrecoverable and probably not recommended in almost every circumstance, unless you're trying to repeatedly sprain a joint, which is, there are times and places where that's going to occur to access a joint position. It's not recommended from a health perspective.
Right. So for anyone trying to understand the difference between an elastic response would be like a rubber band that I pull and it snaps back. A plastic response would be like if I pulled hard enough on a Ziploc bag, it would start to stretch and then it would not go back once I let go. That would be a good example of the difference between the two. And there is a point with tension, almost like a tension curve, where you go past the point of where something can come back. And a lot of that time when you have like a ligament strain or you roll the outside of your ankle, you tear some ligament. Anytime you hear like an ACL, PCL, MCL, those tissues, when they get torn, they lose their ability to come back. And a lot of times they never will. Sometimes they actually break and they need to be fixed in some cases. But that's like when someone's thrown their back out, a lot of times there was some over exertion strain to a ligament in their low back, and the nervous system and their spinal cord is trying to protect itself. So they get that sort of like throw you to the ground muscle contraction type of throw the back out.
Right. It's a protective contraction to not expose you to the same region of stress.
Right.
That's what people feel when they feel their back tighten up, so to speak, under those circumstances. But again, it is a response to something. It is not necessarily the problem, although it does contribute to the discomfort.
Yeah. And I think so we kind of briefly touched on, a lot of this comes from yoga. A lot of this comes from purely studying something, looking for the benefits of stretching and then finding them, because that behooves the person studying that and having that hypothesis to say that stretching a muscle helps with X, Y, or Z. Of course, it's going to be in their best interest to find that it does indeed do that. But what we're trying to say is that might be true given whatever they were doing, but the reason why the result is happening and the outcome is happening might not just be because of the stretch to the muscle. It might be the position they were lying on the ground. It might have been the activities associated around them doing that one stretch.
Right.
This
physical shape.
Yeah. And the stretching in and of itself and what is associated with it can provide you a window of opportunity to do other things.
Absolutely.
And even from the pain perspective that you're saying, if I can move past my pain tolerance a little bit and I can get into a position that might be beneficial for me that I haven't been able to achieve before, then maybe that would also be a benefit.
Right. And under those circumstances, we would consider that a flexibility reserve. Right. It's a region that it may behoove you to have access to without the protective response. Again, just in case kind of a thing. So when we talk about like athletes and stretching, it's like we don't want them to stretch in an attempt to enhance length, because number one, it's not going to work anyway. Number two, we have to be concerned about relative timing as to when the stretching is taking place relative to another activity, because there are negative secondary consequences associated with stretching behaviors that are not favorable for things like force production or power production, especially power production, because there's a timing element that's associated with that. If you've ever had, I'm looking for, I think my Stretch Armstrong is at the gym. I should have had
in the purple room. Your Stretch Batman.
Yeah.
I bet I can throw up a video of Stretchy Batman.
Oh, there you go. That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause I mean, it's a nice little representation of a viscoelastic, substance, which would show the delay in its recovery of its normal shape. That's the concern when you have, especially like when we talk about stretching, we're typically talking about like the static stretching where you move your body into a position, you hold the discomfort for a certain period of time. Under those circumstances, you're reflecting the fluid content of the tissues themselves. And so as you squeeze water out of them, it takes a while for the water to come back into them to where they get their normal resilience back. And so that's going to dampen some of the behaviors, especially when you need, like, again, a power related activity. So power is force times distance per unit time, which means there's a time constraint. So if you have to do something quickly, there's going to be a dampening effect because of the consistency of the tissue. Now you've taken some of the water out of it, so now it no longer behaves under its normal like stretchiness, for lack of a better term. It's not going to stretch and release the energy like it normally would. So again, it dampens power outputs. Like if you were going to do a vertical jump, if you want to win a vertical jump contest, aggressively stretch the other guy, like help him get loose, if you will, and don't do any stretching of your own. Most likely you're going to be able to dampen some of his ability to produce a vertical jump because there's a timing element there.
Right. Well, you've created like a stretchier. So when you try to put the force down into the ground, you've created more of a give to all the tissues that would try to respond. So then,
yeah. So instead of capturing energy and being able to release it like a rubber band, you are now probably more like a rope.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good way to think about it. So I think talking about stretching, you had mentioned we've mentioned static stretching so far, and typically there's people's understanding of stretching is usually like passive and static stretching, dynamic stretching, ballistic stretching. People might even have heard of like PNF stretching or contract relax type of stretching. And the thing that anyone listening to this that's clicking on it because it's talking about stretching and they want to know more about stretching and why they should reconsider stretching at all has probably heard things like, if something is tight, you stretch it. If something is weak, you strengthen it. And that sort of model of thinking is not necessarily a good one, because things that are tight or feel like a lot of tension in them are actually probably pulled to their length already. And say hamstrings would be a really good example of this, because if you think about where the hamstring attaches on the skeleton, and if I move the hips forward in space, I actually will increase the distance between the attachments of the hamstring. So it'd be very similar to me like putting my shirt on stretch. And then if I take that sort of shirt and I've moved the two bony attachments away from each other, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for me to want to pull on it even more, because eventually I'm just going to rip my shirt. So why wouldn't I think, instead of maybe trying to change the position of my hands and the orientation of my hands to sort of let the resting length come back to that tissue? And I think that's what that's the sensation a lot of people are getting. And they associate that sensation or any painful sensation with the need to stretch.
Well, okay. So let's clarify where the sensation is actually coming from.
Sure, that would be helpful,
because it helps understand. It's not the contractile element of the muscle. So you have muscle fibers that are surrounded by like they're enclosed in connective tissue. They are attached to everything else via connective tissues. So the sensation that's being produced is almost exclusively from the connective tissues themselves. Okay, the signaling anyway. Let's put it that way. Right? Because we can have brain perceptions that create sensations that don't require anything at all. But tightness is a really bad descriptor because it doesn't tell you the state of the tissue itself. So if I take a muscle and I contract it and I'm pulling on the connective tissues that attach it to a bone, I will have a sense of tightness that we would typically describe. I could also have a muscle that is actually at its full length and pulling on the connective tissues because of that, and I will have a sense of tightness. So I have two states of muscle activity, but yet producing the same sensation. Therefore, chasing the sense of tightness and saying that a stretch would be a solution to it doesn't respect, number one, the muscle behavior and orientation, nor does it respect the understanding of how the connective tissues actually work, to what the best of our knowledge anyway. Right. So again, chasing tightness is usually a bad idea.
Right. And it's sort of strange when you think about it from an outside perspective. If something feels tight and then I'm moving it to a point of feeling more tightness, why would that be helpful? It's like in my mind now, I mean, I have the curse of knowledge to kind of look past it, but thinking about it from, a previous version of myself would have believed the same thing. Is just like these stretches are important because they're turning down, they're inhibiting the muscle. So you're getting this sort of what they would call like autogenic inhibition, where I stretch something long enough and then the contraction ability of that. Yeah, Sherrington's principles and things like that.
Oh, Charles. I love Charles, but I don't necessarily agree with him. I don't agree with him.
Well, it just gave some people ways to validate their use of stretching.
Yes, I understand.
But it's, I'm trying to think of the other things that people typically say. It's anyone that feels tight or starts to lose the ability to move around, or their mobility or they'll just say, I need to stretch. I know I need to stretch more. And I ask them, what makes you say that? And a lot of times it's doctor recommended. Anyone that has back pain, they'll be asked by a doctor if they stretch.
Like you got back pain, walk, stretch your hamstrings. Like those are like
stretch your hamstring, or stretch your back even.
As if you could.
Like lay on your side and do that sort of like what do they call that? Where the lower body rotation to get the
or trunk rotation.
Yeah, no, it's like it has a specific name, like not cobra,
scorpion.
Yeah, like a scorpion style stretch where you're just like sort of straining, just trying to get a pulling sensation through your low back as a way to, But what's really happening is just a continuation of what you're talking about with the lowering the pain tolerance to that area.
Potentially.
Yeah. Because as soon as you get back
there's other things that can happen. It's like you get enough tension in the right place, and you can actually create this temporary analgesia. Right.
Yeah.
But it's not a solution, right? It's just one of those physiological effects that takes place in certain circumstances. You could be doing the absolute wrong thing.
Yeah, and a good way to think about it. So I don't know if we talked about this yet, but a good mental model would be the behavior that got you into a certain situation, be it injury or lack of mobility over time, or one of these situations. If that behavior still persists beyond any type of intervention that you make, you're just going to backslide. And we'll have a podcast later where we talk about the reasons why you're not progressing and the reasons why you keep failing. And a lot of it is just that. It's not really looking at what the root cause of the problem is and addressing any sort of movement behaviors or other lifestyle behaviors that have gotten you into this position to begin with. Like you didn't fall over the cliff until you got pushed far enough and then you fell in. It's that mindset of, well, I've always used to do it this way and it never hurt, but now all of a sudden doing it this way hurts. Those are the people that have a very hard time ever reclaiming any sort of pain-free movement, because the strategy that they're going to adopt after treatment is going to be the same one that got them into treatment to begin with.
Correct.
So I think that's
one of those battles. That's one of those battles that you fight with people that they're going through a process to improve movement, reduce pain, whatever it may be, and then they want to continue with the activities that created the problems in the first place.
Yeah, they're like, I want to get back to my sprint triathlon training, but every time I run, the first mile and a half feels like my knee is going to explode. So at some point in that process, if neither the athlete in question or the trainer or the clinician that's working with that person is asking any sort of question about how that person runs, then shame on everyone involved. It's because that needs to be the fundamental question. It isn't about like what types of stretches does this person need to do, or what sort of exercises does this person need to do outside of running. Those things might be supportive and help you find the positions that you need to attain while you're running to not be not to experience pain. But a lot of times, if that's the route that you're going to take with just a bunch of esoteric exercises and stretches, just hoping, you're just rolling dice, and you're really relying on luck to try to fix a problem that could be addressed otherwise.
Right. So one of the things, and we touched on this earlier, but probably didn't give it its full explanation. Like the stretching literature, when they're showing what they perceive as changes in range of motion, what they're measuring is that they're measuring a shape change that truly does exist, but it's not a relative motion change. So it's not what we would consider joint movement. Like a relative joint movement would be where a joint can turn in one direction and the opposing bone that forms that joint would turn in the opposing direction. What we're getting is they take something to the end range where there is no relative motion available, and then they push it beyond that. And that's what produces the sensation of a stretch. Now, because there's a time factor of a hold, because you're leaching water from those tissues, then it takes time for those tissues to recover. That's what maintains what is the perception of the range of motion under those circumstances. Okay, so again, what they're measuring is, again, their perception is we're changing a joint position. I would respectfully disagree. What changes joint positions is actually the muscle activity itself. If you do nothing to alter the muscle activity, then you get a temporary change in shape, but not a change in the relative position of the joint. And so this is why for people that do perceive a gain in some benefit when they stretch, this is why you have to keep doing it. Like the people that complain, they come in and say, my hip flexors are always tight. I stretch and I stretch and I stretch, but they're always tight. You know why? Because you're not doing anything to influence the position of the joint itself. And so you still have the same muscle activity. They're pulling on the same connective tissues. And so you will consistently reproduce the same sensation over and over and over again. And so what you perceive the solution to be, because of the sensation that you feel and your mental model of what you think you're doing, this is why you're failing.
Yeah, so it's so understanding that, I want to kind of circle back to something that you said in there. Muscle activity is like dependent upon the position of the skeleton, yes, the position that your joints are in. So we can use both to sort of assist the other. But in order to understand that, the mental model you kind of have to take to look past what you already believe about stretching, and that, just tension through a muscle and taking it to its length at range of motion is going to somehow change the position of the joints. It wouldn't really be as useful for you to understand it from that perspective. But to think about, like, what are the other, what we mentioned before in other podcasts, like counterfactuals, like what are the other things that are happening that you might not be taking into consideration? So let's say, like, if I'm on my side doing a quadriceps stretch for the front of my thigh, I've actually taken my position on the ground versus gravity, and my skeleton will actually take a different shape. Correct. Based on the position that I'm in. So with given enough time, me being in that position, breathing, holding my quadricep in a stretch, it might help me when I get up to do whatever motion that I wanted to do, but not necessarily because I stretched the quad, but right, more so I've changed the shape of my skeleton based on its position against gravity for that given amount of time.
Yeah. So let's use that position, okay, as an explanation. So here's what happens. If you were to lay flat on your back, if you were a big bag of water, which you are, and you lay on your back, you would flatten out against the surface and spread sideways. That would reduce your front to back diameter. You'd get wider sideways and you'd get narrower front to back. Okay. Under those circumstances, it makes it very difficult for you to turn inward. If you were to do the old heel to butt, like you bend your knee, you grab your foot, you pull your heel to your butt to stretch your quadriceps muscle. In that circumstance, that shape of the pelvis cannot be accessed in this supine, laying on your back position, spread out sideways. If you lay on your side, Okay, because of gravity pushing you down, you actually expand your front to back diameter, and that shape actually promotes the ability to turn inward more effectively. Now, if you were to do that stretch and you get the shape change, it actually allows the hip to turn inward with relative motion. So your perception is that you gained flexibility because of the quad stretch, when the reality is that you laid on your side, you took a breath, and you got bigger front to back and then turned inward because of that. Had nothing to do with the fact that you were yanking and pulling on your thigh. It just so happened that you were doing that at the same time you did something favorable to acquire that position. And thus, the failure of certain models. Now, because you do that, you say quad stretch, better hip position. You go, it was the quad stretch because that's the thing that I felt the most, when the reality was it was a sensation that you really couldn't perceive terribly strongly, and therefore you didn't even consider it.
Yeah. So let's use a different position just to kind of give another example of how shape change versus stretching of tissues is actually occurring. So if you have any sort of familiarity with yoga, and you probably will if you clicked on this and you were interested in stretching, if you are in a child's pose and you've sort of achieved a position where you're sitting back to your heels and your butt's on your heels, that would be something that's similar to the bottom of a squat, for instance. So there is a possibility that you finding a way to achieve that position is going to put you in a similar position to you being able to squat, so that after doing that stretch, which is really what we're saying is just a way to change the shape of your skeleton versus gravity. Because again, that sort of position where I'm in quadruped or facing the ground, the gravity is going to allow me to get some expansion from front to back a little bit easier, so I don't get squeezed from front to back as much like I would when I was if I was on my back. And then that can allow me to achieve a shape that can give me all the way into that deep hip and knee flexion. Right. So your squat might improve, but it isn't because I had you sit back in a child's pose with your knees out to stretch your groin muscles. It wasn't a groin stretching problem. It was literally a shape change that needed to happen in your pelvis and your rib cage to allow you to get to that depth.
Correct. And then the muscle activity that would be associated with that shape change.
Yeah, and that's why movement patterns become important. And anytime someone talks about functional movements and squats and hinges and lunges and things like that, these are all shapes.
The F word. You said the F word.
We're gonna have to say it at some point.
Stop the podcast. Stop the podcast. We got to take a break here. That is the most redundant concept I have ever heard.
What, the functional movement?
It's like saying what other kind of movement is there? What other kind of movement is there?
Non-functional movement. Yeah, just understanding that.
Okay, neurologic disorders aside.
Yes.
Neurologic disorders aside. All movement has an intention, whether you're aware of it or not. Okay, which means that there's no such thing as, you don't need to put the F word in front of movement. You just call it movement. It's just movement.
Yeah.
Leave it alone.
I'm gonna have to put a blinking.
People that throw that qualifier in front of it are merely adding a word that is unnecessary.
Right.
It's just movement. It's
based on commercial models and the perpetuation of those models. But that was a really fun Bill Hartman trigger moment that we had.
Oh well,
stop the podcast.
I got a list of dirty words, and
that's one of them. Well, anyway,
it's the
man, we just derailed that thing. I'm trying to think
about
where
I had to put a stop to it because I will not allow this to be on the podcast. Well,
I'm going to put that part in. It's just that we'll see what your response is.
It's like people got to know these things. It's like it's just gonna had I not jumped in and saved you from that, the perception.
What would have happened?
Oh my God! You would have perpetuated an unnecessary element of jargon that is not helpful. Jargon is useful and helpful. That is not, absolutely not. Because if I got a person with a 30-day certification in fitness that's talking to a client and they're expressing that, they have no idea why they're saying it. They're just repeating it. And then it gets repeated, and then people keep saying it, and then it's not helpful. And then it creates this unnecessary qualifier that supposedly has meaning, and it doesn't.
So the future episode of reconsidering the F word. Well, we have to do it. If this is something that is jargon that people perpetuate and it's wrong, then we need to address it. And that's all I was trying to do. It's just try to tell it.
But it gave me an opportunity.
Try to tell the story in the language that the people already know. But anyways, like talking about, being able to attain these different movement patterns, call them whatever types of movements you want. So typically you think about squatting and lunging and hinging and reaching and pulling and all of these things that are, primal patterns that people might call them. It's just, whatever. So it's a good model. It's a model that people use, be it good or bad. But what it gives people is it gives people a goal and some type of position that they think they need to attain, and they're going to try to stretch their way into that position. But what Bill, kind of going back to what we were talking about, all Bill and I are trying to say is the reason why certain stretches seem to be helpful to get to the bottom of a squat or to touch your toes is not necessarily because it's definitely, I'm not even going to say not necessarily. It is not because you are stretching the muscle and you are getting length in a muscle that's allowing the joint.
Thank goodness. Think about this. Think about this. If stretching worked, right? If stretching created any measure of permanent change, what a nightmare it would be to try to balance everything out. Oh my gosh, it would be impossible.
Well, we would eventually just turn into, I'm imagining like a Ziploc bag full of water that you just throw onto the ground.
Well,
that would be what we all
be like a boneless
chicken.
Like, that's how I describe a boneless chicken, right?
Yeah.
It's like boneless chicken, whatever.
There would be nothing to push against.
Correct.
You would just flatten. Yeah. And that would be it.
Yeah. What a nightmare. What a nightmare.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think we've kind of touched on, but we didn't really specifically say what is happening to the muscle when we stretch. Because I didn't let you continue with that thought earlier on.
In most circumstances, it is trying to resist.
So it's the opposite of what people think.
Yes. Like why do you feel tension? Well, because the connective tissues are under tension. Well, what puts connective tissues under tension? That would be the muscle tissue themselves.
Yeah. So you have these series components. So these things that kind of go from the connective tissues go from the bone to ligaments or tendons and then into muscle. And it's sort of this continuous flow of tissue. But what Bill's trying to say is that when you stretch, the contractile components in the middle, the muscle components, are actually trying to resist being torn apart. And the stretch that you're feeling might actually just be bone and ligament or tendon sort of giving way.
Yeah. And again, by position, not because of the stretch itself, but by position, you can actually learn how to reduce some of that muscle activity, right? But in many cases, all you have to be able to do is make certain physical contacts with a surface, right? Produce certain types of muscle activity, increased muscle activity in a direction that will produce true relative joint ranges of motion.
Yeah. And it's, a lot of it is similar to the other things we talked about. It's knowing the rules, first of all, and then using intentional movement in order to utilize those rules for change, and not just blindly stretching everything in the hopes that you throwing a bunch of stuff against the wall will lead to something sticking. Because typically the story that you and I are going to hear is I stretch and stretch and stretch and nothing happens. Yeah. So let's we're a little bit all over the place, but I think we got some good stuff into this.
I don't care.
I'm going to give, I want to give like a closing, I'll give like a closing statement, and then you can give a closing statement and we'll wrap it up. This is definitely something we'll have to expand upon later when we have a podcast about reconsidering functional movement.
Oh, you said it again.
Well, we're gonna have
Here it
to.
comes.
People
Oh,
think
here it
people
comes.
crave that. They're gonna click on it because they see that. But anyways, so getting people to look past the concept that stretching something that hurts or that is feels tight is going to actually help it in some way. And then even if you were to do a stretch, like say we had talked about like a child's pose stretch or a frog stretch, it was just more of the example I was giving, or laying on your side, stretching your quad, or even sitting on your butt, reaching forward and trying to touch your toes. All of these positions involve you laying on the ground and breathing, because you have to breathe over time, and you're going to be driving movement and shape change against the ground with different relationship to gravity. And that in the end is probably what is going to be giving you that result or the outcome that you were looking for.
Yeah.
And on top of and on top of that, the thing that you're getting after changing shape, giving yourself a window of opportunity, it's going to be more important how you use that window and the behaviors and the movement behaviors that got you into that problem to begin with. If you always have had tight hamstrings for the last 10 years, it probably has something to do with what you're doing and how you move that's causing that to happen.
Stretching isn't bad. Okay. It just doesn't do what people think it does. And I think that just perpetuates the problem that we're trying to solve with this discussion, right? It goes back to your toolbox kind of a concept. It's like, okay, if I need to drive a nail, it's like the screwdriver is not the right tool for the job. It's like, what am I trying to do? Do I need to create a flexibility reserve? Okay, static stretching would be useful under those circumstances, right? Do I need to maintain the resilience of a tissue? Absolutely. Do I want to put tension through a tissue as it heals so that the repair is oriented as the previous tissue was, so I don't promote a relatively permanent restriction in movement? Absolutely. All of those things become useful. But again, some of those have nothing to do with the fact that I got to put myself in a position and hold it there. It's like the principle is I need to move this tissue through an excursion on a regular basis, which doesn't require that I do prolonged holds. Okay. Again, that's always the perception of stretching. Like again, yoga uses a series of posture changes, sides, inversion, upright. That effect probably has more to do with anything than trying to affect one muscle. Humans determined the concept of muscles, right? We said that they were separate entities. They are not. They all interact. And so what we're doing is we're trying to promote shape changes. Doesn't mean that you don't have to avoid the sensations. It doesn't mean that it's bad, but there's a time and a place and a use for it. And it's not what people think. That's all.
Reconsider is sponsored by Substance Nutrition. Go to substancenutrition.com. Get your Neuro Coffee, better brain, and Synthesis, better protein, better body. Enter the coupon code RECON, RECON, and get free shipping on all of your orders.